And welcome to another exciting episode of The Energy That Surrounds Us. I'm your host, Michael, and today I'm joined with a guest who is somebody I have followed and my parents have followed for years and always enjoy her work. And I have to admit, I am containing my excitement for having her on my show. And we were talking about this before we got started. And so I am going to turn it over before I start to ramble on for an eternity to the one, the only, the amazing, wise, and awesome, and so nice Barbara Lamb.
Well, thank you. That's a unique introduction, and I appreciate it. So I'll just give a little information about myself. Um, well, I am basically a psychotherapist for a long time. I was licensed in the state of California in 1976, believe it or not. And I did that counseling practice, therapy practice, until 2017 when I moved from where I was to San Diego, California. But through all of these years, I've been continuing to do regression therapy. And that's what we're mostly going to be talking about tonight, things that I have learned from the regression therapy sessions that I have done with a few thousand people. So in 1984, I realized that I was very, very interested by that time in past lives because I had been to Egypt and Peru and Greece and various places where suddenly, to my amazement, in certain spots, um, things happened. Memories came up from a long time ago, lifetimes ago, sometimes hundreds of years ago. It first happened in Peru, and then it happened when I was in Egypt. And I thought, this isn't just my imagination. I have a very strong sense of remembering. And in the remembering, I was always a different person than I am now. Sometimes I was a male. Sometimes I had very, very dark skin and dark hair. Sometimes I was a female with long dark hair. So, but it seemed like it was me and that I had had those experiences. So I became very interested in reincarnation and anything I could learn about it. And then in 1984, I met the woman who had founded a wonderful group called the Association for Past Life Research and Therapies. And I was so impressed, not only with that woman, but with all of her colleagues at a conference that I went to, conference put on by that group. And I was just dazzled. I thought, this is wonderful. These are very, very accomplished professional licensed therapists. And in their practices, they're doing a lot of past life regressions, mostly to get to the source, the original root of a client's problem, whatever that problem was. And so, as I was going through 5 years of training in past life regression therapy, occasionally one of my regular counseling clients, had some sort of difficulty going on. And it occurred to me, maybe I could be helpful to this person by regressing the person into wherever this problem originated. And in many of those cases, the problems had originated in previous lifetimes. So that was very helpful. And that whole process seemed to be effective in helping the person to get over whatever that particular problem was. And in those regressions, so this is still in the 1980s, in those regressions, sometimes to my surprise and to the client's surprise, they found that they themselves had been extraterrestrial beings in previous lifetimes. Now, at that point in time, in terms of my development, I had never heard of that before. I had never heard of human beings living among us now, having had lifetimes when they were extraterrestrial beings. So I became more and more interested in that. Like, oh, wow, I want to know more about that. So then in the last module of training, which was 1988, the trainer woman, whom I respected tremendously, said, those of us who were being trained to be past life regression therapists, we needed to know that it's possible that at some time somebody might come to us who is complaining about having been approached by unusual beings, and they're not human. They didn't know what they were, but they weren't human, and that they seem to have been taken away for an hour and a half or 2 hours and always returned, but that they were totally mystified. And usually they would have remembered just the very first few moments of an encounter with some of these beings. And they wanted to know more. They wanted to know, well, what happened during that hour or two that I was missing conscious awareness of? So that drew my interest even more. And anyway, in 1991, it just happened that along with other people coming for sort of everyday reasons for therapy, um, that people started to come because they had had very unusual visits from very unusual beings, whom we later identified as what we call extraterrestrial. And so I started doing regressions then, that year, 1991, regressions to people's encounters with these unusual off planet beings. And it was opening up an enormous field of interest for me that I hadn't realized was even in existence. And it just seemed like the universe kept feeding me one person after the other who had had those kinds of experiences. Now, I was not advertising in any way that I was doing that particular kind of work. And I think it's miraculous, really, how people found me. I mean, it was easier to find me as a regression therapist, but those people who found me didn't have any idea whether or not I knew about this aspect of things, about people having encounters with these extraterrestrial beings. So, anyway, everything really, really opened up for me that year. And not only the extraterrestrial part of it, but that was the same year that I started going to England in the summer to visit and investigate and experience the crop circles. So those two paths seemed to go parallel to each other while I was still doing my regular therapy work. And I had the strongest feeling right from the beginning when I first saw my first picture of a crop circle. I had the strongest feeling that, oh, we're being communicated with from someone out there. That's what my thought was before even specifically knowing about extraterrestrial beings. And I still think so in terms of the crop circles. I still think that there is, at least we can say, There is another intelligence. I would assume it's a higher intelligence than most of us have, that lay down these beautiful symbolic patterns in the fields of our growing crops, mostly in England, and yet they're all over the world, wherever people are growing crops, which is just about everywhere. And we even have quite a number of crop circles that have happened right here in the US and in Canada, and many other countries as well. So, anyway, I went to England every summer for 25 years to experience and study the crop circle phenomenon. And for about 12 of those years at least, or maybe more, I took tour groups sometimes with me for a week or so. And that was really exciting and opened up a whole new world for each of those participants. The people who came on my tours for crop circles all came from United States. And so they were experiencing England and that wonderful culture, often for the first time. But the main thing is that we visited many crop circles and would spend an hour or two, or sometimes even more, in each crop circle, so that everybody had a chance to really get into the energies, to feel and even measure the energies in the crop circles. And that could be a whole talk on its own, but I will go on from there, just leaving it at that. But anyway, I certainly became very aware because of these clients coming for regressions to their experiences with these other beings, and also my continuing work with the crop circles. More and more kept opening up to me about the universe, the cosmos, and all of the millions, probably trillions of beings, of very, very intelligent life that lives out there in space on these other planets. And over the years, especially working with other people in regressions, I have just learned more and more and more about those beings. But I'd like to say right away that it's very apparent to me that those extraterrestrial beings know a lot more about us human beings than we know about them. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that they have a way of knowing us remotely. Now, I don't know if they use a process like some of our people do in remote viewing, or maybe it's more of a psychic ability. But from wherever they are on a craft or another planet or just out in space, they seem to, if they focus on it, they seem to know a lot about us humans. And some of them particularly know a lot about particular individual humans or certain families of humans. And that comes out more and more. So, over the years since 1991, oh, I have heard so much about so many, many different kinds of beings. So sometimes people think of the whole UFO phenomenon as just crafts flying around, like our government is talking about currently. And they say, well, yeah, there must be some intelligence guiding those UFOs or UAPs, as they're called nowadays by the government. Uh, and then once in a while, they will admit that, yes, there must be occupants of those UFOs, and there must be intelligent beings of some sort. And they, so far in the government hearings, as far as I know, They haven't gone into that aspect of things very much at all about the beings and what the beings do. So my part is kind of coming from the other end of things, from the individual personal end of these people having encounters with the beings who do come. And yes, it seems like they come on those crafts. Maybe they come in other ways without a UFO. Sometimes it seems like that. Many people are having sightings of UFOs and have been for years. And I've noticed that when a person has really close sightings, in other words, the person will see a craft that's definitely not ours, um, but that craft might be, only 50 feet above the top of their heads, or 50 feet above the house, or maybe 100 feet. Um, and it turns out, even though the person has not consciously known it, it turns out that when there's such a close sighting, and even if they happen more than once, that person, unbeknownst to him or her, has actually had personal encounters with the beings. So if you, listening to this, are a person who sees a lot of UFOs, particularly the close sightings, and if you see orbs, the orbs of light, and keep on seeing those here and there, that chances are very, very likely that you have had encounters with the beings that you may not have any conscious awareness at all. These beings have remarkable abilities from our point of view. And one of them is that they can come into a home, or they can come into wherever the person is whom they want to have contact with. And they make that person to be completely unaware of their being there. And they make other people with that person unaware as well. So we call that being switched off. So many of these encounters with the beings happen when the person is alone. A very typical scenario is that the person might be in bed asleep at night when an encounter begins, or the person might be driving along by himself, or even with somebody else, or might even be in a whole group of people. And that when the beings come, they make not only the person not aware that the encounter is happening, but they also make whoever is with or near or in the vicinity of that person to be unaware also. We call that being switched off. So it's a very typical thing that a person will be sleeping in their own bed at night with a sleeping partner, or with somebody else sleeping in the room. And the one who gets to experience this could very well be aware of something unusual, like little lights flying around in the room. What are those? Or orbs flying around in the room, or just even one orb, or a beam of light coming in through the window, or just an area of light in the room, and they know they don't have any lamp on, and the light doesn't look like lamp light anyway. And as I said, anybody else in the room is switched off, like made to be in a very deep state of consciousness. If it's a sleeping situation, it seems like anybody else in the room is just sound asleep, deeply, deeply asleep. And the person who's going to be having this experience the person for whom these beings came, that person might be aware for just a few moments that there's something different going on in the room. Very often people will say, okay, in the regression, I'm lying here in my bed and I ask details like how are you lying on your back, your stomach, your side? Say, oh, lying on my left side. And then what are you aware of? Oh, well, I'm just aware that there feels like a presence, feels like somebody is in the room. So I'm opening my eyes and I'm looking around and oh, I see all this light. I don't know where the light could be coming from. And I'll ask more questions to be get the details of what they're aware of, and they become more aware as I do that. And then they'll say, "Oh yeah, they're over there. They're over there. I'm on my left side, and they're over there, straight ahead of me, over near the window." And I'll say, "Well, what are you aware of?" And they'll describe, and I'll say, "How many of these are you seeing?" And they'll tell me like one or two or three or whatever. And I keep asking questions. This is all in the regression. And as I ask questions, they become aware of more and more details, including the beings coming over to them and usually levitating them up out of the bed. And the bed covers just sort of slide away. And then they're suspended in the air and floated across the room and out through a wall or a closed window, accompanied by the beings, then into the air and then into the bottom of what seems to be some sort of craft out there in the air. And then the whole experience continues. And so in the regression, it's very helpful to have the person have the sense as much as possible of reliving that experience. And sometimes the experience that we're going back to in regression had happened when the person was very young, a young child, or even a baby in the crib. And the youngest one that I ever had in a regression was actually a grown man who was in his 40s at the time when he came for this regression. But he went back to being a fetus in his mother's womb. And he was visited by an extraterrestrial being who did a wonderful, wonderful thing, even though this baby was still in the mother's womb and the mother was asleep. She wasn't aware of it as far as we know. But anyway, the being came and told the little baby inside the womb that he was there to help and to heal him because he had a big problem going on. He had a congenital hole in his heart, and that if it was not treated, that soon after being born, he would die. And this being didn't want him to die. And so the being sent energy, which the little baby in the womb felt as kind of like a wave of extra warm, nice, comforting air. That's what it felt like. And the being said, I am putting an invisible electromagnetic strip over the hole in your heart so that it will not bleed where it should not be bleeding. And will be saving your life. So that baby was born and grew up to be a big 6 foot tall, husky, strong man eventually. But all during the years of his childhood, at least once every year, sometimes more often, he would be taken by the beings. And this one particular extraterrestrial being would put him on a medical table and do something over his body with his hands. And he said, I am refurbishing the invisible electromagnetic strip over the hole in your heart so that you can continue your life and be perfectly well. So that happened quite a number of times, and we did regressions to several of those visits. It seemed to be a pretty regular thing that this being was helping him. And the boy, as he was growing up, got to know this being better. He didn't look like us. He had very different skin, a different body type, different head shape to some extent, but he had big eyes. And my client said, this is the man with the beveled eyes. They look like different facets to them. And anyway, he was given the name of that being, and they really developed a nice relationship when this being would visit. And he really did save his life, my client's life, again and again. And then eventually, when my client was in his late 40s, he was diagnosed here by earth physicians as having a congenital hole in his heart. And they rushed him into surgery, thinking, uh-oh, this man is not going to last very long unless we take care of this. And by good fortune, his wife happened to be a surgical nurse. So she got permission to be in the operating arena and to watch the surgery of her husband as it was happening, open heart surgery. So when the surgeon got into the heart and discovered what was wrong, he said out loud, "Oh, amazing. This man has a hole in his heart the size of a silver dollar. And yet it's not bleeding very much. It should be, but it isn't." And so that was confirmation for the man's wife that, yes, indeed, he really did have that particular problem. And the surgeon went ahead and did whatever surgeons do here to fix a congenital hole in the heart. And that gave that man, many more wonderful years of life. But in the meantime, this man came to me for quite a number of regressions, probably about 11 or 12 regressions over a period of a few years. And we learned more and more about different kinds of beings that he was also having encounters with, different things that they did. One of the things that they did was to help him to give up cigarette smoking, which they had been suggesting for years, but being addicted to it, he had not given it up. So they enlisted his wife to help him. Now, what I mean by enlisting his wife is that these ETs influenced her mentally from a distance. They didn't take her for this process, but they kept feeding her information and inspiration to help him. So there was one night in particular where they had her lie down behind him on their bed on top of the covers and to reach her arm around to his chest and hold it there. And they sent energy through her hand into his lungs and gave her certain suggestions of various other things to do to help him. And it went on for a couple of hours. And I did a regression with her to find out the details from her point of view of that experience. And make a long story short, The next morning, that man woke up, and instead of reaching for a cigarette, he saw his pack of cigarettes and threw it away in the garbage and said, "That's it. I am no longer smoking." And he no longer did. So that was really wonderful. And it turned out that that woman, unbeknownst to her, until I was working with her husband, uh, she was a long-term experiencer too of extraterrestrial contacts. So I did a few regressions with her over time. And in one of those experiences, she was put into what she called a pod. It was like a bathysphere, sort of a spherical shaped pod sort of thing on board a UFO. And there were four other people from Earth being put into similar pods. And the pod had fluid in it almost up to the top, but she was able to breathe that fluid, uh, like in the movie Abyss. Uh, People were going down into the ocean in a vehicle, and they were learning to breathe in a particular liquid. And so that's what she did. And once she got used to it, it was just fine. And they went in that big craft, those in the pod, uh, went to a place, we don't know where that was, but uh, the pod was opened for each one of those people, and the people were taken out and they coughed up some of the extra fluid. And then they were dressed in robes with big hoods that came past their faces so they could only see each other if they turned and looked directly into the face in the hood. And they were led into a long corridor and by these beings who lived on that particular ship. It seems like it must have been a mothership because they seemed to walk for a long, long time in this corridor, and eventually were taken into a big amphitheater type of room where there were rows and rows of tables and chairs, uh, like an amphitheater. And there were many, many different kinds of beings there. They were all dressed in a similar robe and hood, but she could tell when she could get a glimpse of some of their faces that, oh, they were totally different races or species of extraterrestrial beings. So these four or five from Earth were settled down in their seats at one of these banquet like tables with a cloth in the front. And there were two leaders down on the main floor. And it turned out to be a big council meeting of many different kinds of extraterrestrials. So she realized that she was a representative, or we might say an ambassador from planet Earth. There among many, many different species from, a huge number of other planets. So lots of different kinds of beings. And they were there to discuss different situations between planets. And they came eventually to talk about planet Earth. And they had a dilemma that was being discussed at that meeting. The dilemma was that they had long, long ago helped to create human beings from a more primitive life that had originally been here. And they added genetics of various types of beings. And they made a mistake in planting genetics in those early people. They gave those early people genetics of combativeness, aggressiveness, which turned into warlikeness, um, and aggression, and really being harmful to each other. And so they were very concerned about all the aggression and the combativeness going on Earth. This was in the 1990s when I did this regression. And they were pondering what they should do about that. Should they try to go to Earth and do a mass changing of human genetics? That would be a huge job because the population of Earth had grown to be so massive. So, anyway, that was under discussion, and they wanted the opinion of these 5 delegates, including my client, from Earth. So, scenarios like that kept opening up for not only that client, but for many other uh, clients too. And I certainly have had the impression that there is a vast number of intelligent beings of very different types, some of them more similar to human looking types. Many of them do have that humanoid physique that is a head, neck, shoulders, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso. And yet, within that range, there's a tremendous variation. We've heard of a lot of that. Some of them don't look human at all, except they've got that humanoid 2 arms, 2 legs, and a torso sort of form. For instance, there is the mantis beings. And many people I have worked with have had visits from and encounters with the mantis beings. They're always described as being very, very tall, maybe 6'8", 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet tall in some cases, and very, very slim. Some of them are described as white skinned all over. Some are described as green skinned. Some are described as black skinned. Some of them are described as having a long robe on. And some of these mantis beings seem to have no clothing on, unless it's a very, very form fitting suit. But it seems like they don't have clothing on, according to those experiencers. But in any event, there have been so many descriptions of the mantis beings from many of my clients, and I certainly have the impression that they very often are in charge of whatever the other beings, the shorter beings that we might be more familiar with, whatever they are doing with the person who's been taken there. Um, they don't seem to interfere. They don't seem to do the work on the person themselves, but it's like they're a guide or in charge, sort of an overseer looking on. So people often, if they're there and they're lying on a medical table and they're describing the beings that are around the table right near them, and then they'll often say, oh, and then behind them over there is this very, very tall being with huge eyes, huge black eyes. So I was really frightened at first, but he seems to be kindly, and he seems to be observing and keeping track of what's going on and making sure everything is done correctly. And then there have been people who've had experiences with the mantis beings that are much more up close and personal, and much more friendly. Uh, so one woman was having a lot of visits directly from a mantis being, very tall, very white, and in a long white robe. And he often was the one who would escort her to the UFO where various things went on for her. And he seemed to be very safe, very nice, very kindly. She grew to really be very fond of him. Although when we began our work, she was absolutely terrified because, of course, he was so different and he was unknown. She didn't know what to expect. But she did learn over a period of a few years, when we did a regression now and then, that it really was not only okay to be with him, but it was quite wonderful to have experiences with him. And I love this one particular regression we did when one weekend she was babysitting for her little granddaughter who was about age 4. And they were both taken by the same white being with the long white robe. And he floated them both up together, up to what seemed to be way, 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 way out in space. And it seemed to be like a big white round platform that the three of them were going to stand in the middle of this platform. Just imagine, no railings or anything, just a great big, I mean, a couple of 100 feet in diameter, and they were in the middle, so it seemed fairly safe. And then um, the mantis being sort of leaned down and took the hand of the little girl with one of his hands and took the hand of my client, the grandmother, in the other hand. And they sort of did a little game, like a little sing-songy game, like Ring Around the Rosie. Wasn't exactly that song, but very similar. And the little girl was laughing and having a wonderful time. And my client was feeling very happy that the little girl was doing fine with all of this and appreciating the kindness and the playfulness even of this very, very tall mantis being. So he also, on other occasions, took her to different planets and introduced her to different beings. And one time he took her, what seemed to her to be way, 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 way out in space, further than usual. And she could see as they were flying along, not with a craft around them or anything, she could see that they were approaching what looked like a crystal city floating out in space. Seemed like all the buildings were glass or crystal, and there were spires and domes and beautiful pyramid shapes, and what was really a very intriguing looking place. And they went right to it and into the city and into one of those crystal buildings. And he introduced her to another being, not a mantis being, a different sort, but tall and very thin. And he sort of tested my client about what she was seeing, because she would see his face looking kind of like a horror creature. And he telepathically knew that she had had a history since being a little girl of watching horror films. There was somebody in her family who thought it'd be just great fun to watch horror films with her. So she watched them since she was probably about 3 years old. And this being was able to telepathically know how she was seeing him. And he would call her on distorting what she was seeing, looking at his face. And then she'd see it a little more clearly for a moment or two, and it wasn't scary. And then she'd distort again and see it as a horror figure. And he'd know that telepathically. He was watching her closely. And he kept saying, "No, you're distorting, you're distorting. Blink your eyes, look again, take a deep breath, let yourself relax, and then tell me what you see." So they kept that up for quite a while, probably an hour or so, until she learned to kind of get through her fear and be more relaxed and see him as he really was. Now, he did not look like a human, but he did not look scary once she was able to sort of relax into it. And that was a great service for her, that experience, because subsequently, when she was taken to meet other kinds of extraterrestrial beings, she had so much less fear because she wasn't distorting whatever they looked like, although that was different than what we looked like. But she was no longer distorting those faces into something absolutely horrific. So we did many regressions, and she finally, toward the end of our time together, she was taken. Oh, and I would like to mention this part of it, taken to a wonderful experience, but she had gotten to the point after probably 12 or 15 regressions over a period of a few years. She had gotten to the point where she really wanted to be conscious and awake completely for the whole experience when it would happen again. And so she said, "What can I do to bring that about?" And I said, "Well, as far as I know, you can send out that thought to them. Think of them and just send out that thought that you want to be conscious and awake and present, aware whenever they next would come for you." So she did that, and indeed it happened. They visited again, and they levitated her up off the bed, and she was conscious and awake, and they floated her across the room, and then everything was fine. And then she looked down from where she was suspended, floating prone across the room, and she noticed that she was about 6 feet or so above the floor. And suddenly, out of instinct, she sort of panicked and flailed around, arms and legs, and they immediately wrapped her in a netting. She described it looking kind of like a fish net, and she wrapped her in the netting, like wrapping her up in a cocoon, and then floated her through the wall and out into the air and into the spaceship. And they said, as they were wrapping her up, "We thought this would probably happen, and we need to contain you for your safety and for our safety." They didn't want to be hit by all this flailing around of arms and legs, and they didn't want her to hurt herself. So they floated her through the wall, through the air, into the ship, stood her upright, right, and then unpeeled this wrap around netting sort of thing. So she was free to be just on the ship and move around. And it turned out that that was a really wonderful, incredible experience for her, because there was one being right there watching the unfurling of the netting, right there ready to meet her. And he had been channeling to her. She had for years been picking up messages, but never really knew who the messages were coming from. So it was a very happy thing to meet him. And he did not look human, but he had, he was upright, 4 arms, 4 legs, and so forth. And that was a very nice thing. And in addition to that, there was a very luminous, glowing being, white, glowing light around a being who was sitting on something. She said she had the impression he was sitting on a throne. In other words, a really substantial chair of some sort. And she could just barely see through this bright, bright glow of white light around him, could see the being in there. And she had a wonderful encounter with him. So, this brings me to the topic of other dimensional beings. We usually think of encounters, or as many people call them, abductions, um, by physical extraterrestrial beings. And indeed, there are millions and millions of cases of that. There are also cases of people having visits from and being taken by what seem to be other dimensional beings. In other words, they do not seem to be physical and quote unquote solid, the way that we physical beings are, even though physicists tell us we're not really dense and solid, we're molecules and atoms and so forth. But anyway, these other beings seem to be much more ethereal. Um, so they can often be seen in a room when they visit somebody, um, but they don't seem to be dense and sort of solid the way that humans are to us. They might have a lot of glowing to them, they might be almost transparent, but they do definitely have a sense of presence that the person feels. And very often they can see the being, although more faintly in many cases than they could see somebody who would be in the full physical form. But these beings come from many different realms and different planets, different civilizations, and they always seem to be very benevolent, um, and very enlightened, and of course, full of light. Sometimes people have described that they'll wake up at night and right by their bed is standing what kind of looks like a tall, thin oval shape of light. It might be white, it might be pink, it might be blue. People have mentioned those colors. And then as they look at this oval shape more, they realize that, ah, in in the center portion of that oval, it's more dense, it's more congealed. And then they look further and they realize, oh, there's a face. In other words, this is a being of some sort. And the being will talk to them telepathically, like the other ones do. And that being is definitely not there to frighten that person. It's there to add unconditional love or some other kind of help to that person. And that when people realize this in a regression, and I say, would you like to ask anything of this being, which they had not thought would be possible? And I say, you can just ask out loud, or you can ask with just in your mind, and the being will be able to know that, to read your mind. And so they'll ask, and sometimes the being will say things like, "Oh, we've come to just to give you extra blessings because we know that you're going through a difficult time in your life, or we come to heal you because we know you have a particular problem," and they'll mention what that problem is, or we're just coming to check on you, make sure you're okay, and We're giving you our blessing. So it always turns out to be a very nice, loving, kind experience. And that's true very often when the person is taken away from their home, taken onto a craft by these other dimensional beings, that they always realize after a while that the beings are being very loving, caring, and sometimes they'll use that phrase, unconditional loving. So wonderful it is that some people have those kinds of experiences. I'm emphasizing these because I think in the public at large, there's sort of an impression that, the extraterrestrials, the aliens, as they're often called, um, are negative and are threatening, are fearsome, scary, um, out here to do harm or to torture people or take over the world. And I don't think any of that is really true when you really look into it. So many people have the experience of being taken by unusual beings, taken aboard on board a craft and put onto a cold, hard medical type table and have different procedures done on their bodies. This is very, very typical. And and of course, it's very frightening and distressing, and they can't move, they can't call out. They can usually move their eyes around, to see more about the room, see if there's anybody else there, and so forth. But they can't really move their head totally or their bodies. And then they might experience that they're being poked and probed, or skin samples are being scraped, or hair is being cut, or an implant might be inserted, or eggs taken from a woman, sperm from a man. And so, of course, those experiences can be really horrific. But in those kinds of experiences that come up in a regression, during the regression, I will usually say, would you like to know what these beings are doing to you and why? And the person usually says, yes, I would like, because they're completely befuddled about what's going on and why. And so I say, well, you can ask them, you can ask out loud, or you can ask it just in your mind, and they will be able to realize what you're asking in any case. And so they ask, usually in their minds, and just within moments, they hear an answer from the beings. So if the beings are doing a sort of an intrusive examination on the person's body, they will say things like, well, we're really checking the systems of your body to see how you are really doing. We have a way of being more thorough in our testing than the doctors on your earth do. And even with a proctological exam, which of course people do not like here on earth or on the ship, but they have said to a couple of my clients, this particular exam, this proctological exam, is the one that can give us more information about all the systems of your body than any of the other tests combined. And that's why we do this. Not to harm you, not to torture you, make you miserable, but this gives us so much information. And then we know what to go ahead and help with. So with these physical procedures that go on, many times the beings will say, we have detected a problem in your liver or pancreas or whatever organ they have found the problem in. And so we've detected that problem, and now we're going to heal it. And very often the person is aware that there's some kind of light coming to them on the table. It might be kind of a beam of light, might be a more narrow beam, like a beam from a flashlight looking piece of equipment. It might be like a roller of light, or it might be a general infusion of light all around the person's body, and often so bright that they can hardly see the beings anymore who are giving them this light. So there are various ways that the person is actually being healed. Once in a while, it seems to be more of a hands on healing from one of or more than one of the beings. And then there are occasions when the beings have detected a particular problem, let's say in the left kidney, as an example, and they'll, instead of healing it, they will tell the person, you have a problem in your left kidney, and we strongly suggest that when you're on Earth again, you go to your Earth doctor and ask that doctor to check your left kidney because we detect a serious problem there. And you may not even know that you have the problem, and your doctor may not even know, but have him check it because it really needs attention. So that is actually a favorable thing for that person. And the person usually does not remember the details of that experience consciously, but uh, does somehow remember that warning about the kidney. And did you remember to ask the doctor to check that out? But there are so many cases of healing that people have had that I'm aware of when they're on the ship. And it's really a wonderful thing. Um, there's a friend of mine, a colleague named Preston Dennett, and he has collected stories of healing from me and from other people as well. I think now he's written 2 books about UFO healings, and they're all from actual cases, real people who've had these things happen. And then I know people too, um, certain friends and other, regression clients who've been healed right at home. And they'll be very troubled with a particular sickness or organ failure and miserable lying in bed. And they'll have visitors come and heal whatever that malady is right then and there in the person's home, in the person's bed. There are lots of cases of that. And one young woman I regressed, who had been missing, by the way, missing at her work for 3 whole days. And they kept calling her. And of course, she didn't answer because she wasn't there. uh, and they were really getting worried. And after 3 days, she suddenly found herself on the hard wooden floor of her home and gradually realized what day it was and thought, what happened? I just lay down on my couch for a nap after work 3 days ago, and now here I am on the floor, and it's 3 days later. Well, she had been taken, and she had been healed of a very serious blood disorder that she had already. She'd had it for quite a while, but didn't know that she had it. She knew she didn't feel up to par, but she didn't really know what was wrong. But the beings during that 3 days, they put her in a sort of a tubular machine, a scanning machine, From her description, it sounded very much like our MRI type of machine. And they could see what was wrong. And then they kept her for 2.5 more days and suspended her in the air about 6 foot up from the floor. She wasn't lying on anything, just sort of floating in the air, but kept there. And there was always somebody to be with her and watch her and make sure everything was okay. And there were laser beams coming from all over and through her body, laser beams of different colors of light, from the ceiling, from the walls, from the floor, all penetrating her body and arresting the development of this blood disorder. And one of the beings whom she recognized then from having seen many other times before that, um, this being was explaining to her that they had detected that she had a particular type of blood disorder that most humans do not have. And it's the type of thing that is progressive. Once a person has that disorder, it will keep uh, progressing until the person develops leukemia and then eventually dies. They said, we cannot cure what has already happened because of your blood disorder, but we are stopping it, we're arresting it so that it will not develop any further, so that you will not have to develop leukemia and die decades before you are meant to die. And so that was very important, that work that they did. So then they returned her to the floor right in front of the sofa where she had gone to sleep and from which she had been taken. And she didn't know. That was in 1973. She didn't know that she had had that experience. She only knew that she had somehow missed 3 whole days of time without any awareness of it. So then, a few years later, her medical doctors here on Earth realized that she had that blood disorder. But they were puzzled because they said, with any other case of a person having this particular kind of blood disorder, it has progressed and progressed, and the person has always ended up having leukemia and didn't live very long after that. But somehow, we don't understand it, but somehow your blood disorder has not progressed. It stopped somewhere in earlier years. And she still, at that point, didn't know about this extraterrestrial experience until, probably 15 years or so later, she had a regression with me. And that's when all of this information came out about the healing with the laser lights on board the ship by the extraterrestrial beings. And that woman is still going on, carrying on very well in her life. The blood disorder has not progressed. What was done, but she's functioning very well and continuing to have a normal life. So we give a lot of credit to those extraterrestrial beings. So you
Yeah.
see, a lot of people have the impression that oh, it's a terrible thing that these beings come and torture people and poke and probe and do all kinds of awful things. But what they don't know, it's not their fault, but what they don't know is that so many good things, so many helpful things happen to so many of these people with the beings. Yes, Michael, were you about to
Right.
say something?
Oh, I was going to point out that we're running over the hour, and I didn't know
Oh,
if you had time to answer some questions that had come in.
sure.
So Linda Judd was asking when we were talking about crop circles if you've heard of Lucy Pringle in the UK. She has a couple of
Yes.
decades of photographing them.
Oh, I know Lucy. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman. And yes, she's done great photography. Still doing it this summer. She was, and she is the one who discovered that the energies of some of the crop circles are really healing people of physical problems. And she discovered it in the early 1990s when she and a friend went to visit the crop circles, which were about an hour's drive from where she lived in Hampshire County. And she had a very, very painful shoulder. It was really hurting her as she was driving the car to that crop circle. And they stayed in the crop circle for a few hours, actually. They had brought a picnic lunch and some tea in a thermos and settled down in the crop circle and relaxed in it. And then on the way home, she was driving again and she suddenly realized, oh, my shoulder isn't hurting. And it never did hurt after that. It had been healed by the energy of the crop circles. So that, of course, really got her attention. And she started doing a study, which she has done for many years. She's probably still doing it, gathering accounts of people who had specific healings like that in crop circles. So she's done that. And all of these years, since the early 1990s, she's taken excellent photographs from the air of crop circles. Yeah, she is a superb woman. I am very, very pleased to know her.
Very cool. And the next question I have actually is mine. And I'll ask it 'cause since we're looking at crop circles, talking about them right now, is I wonder with if you're familiar with like the Nazca lines, how
Yes,
there's these
I've seen.
images seen from space, and I can't help wondering now with the crop circles, are the same people making both, but one is on land versus in crop fields, so that's why we call them two different things.
Right. Well, I have seen the Nazca lines from a small airplane uh, and the figures in the earth, particularly the figures, have impressed me and are very much, in a sense, like the crop circles, except that they're dug into the dirt, the hard brown dirt, rather than a growing crop. So I don't know if it's the same beings. Of course, the Nazca lines were made, and the figures were made many centuries ago. And the crop circles, there were occasional reports of crop circles during the various centuries, but not really noticed particularly until the 1980s and more since then. But it's the same idea, I think, that some intelligence, we don't know exactly what it is, some intelligence from somewhere else, certainly seems to be from space rather than from Earth, um, has been coming and doing these things, the Nazca figures, the Nazca lines, the crop circles. Yeah, and so I think Eric von Daniken really had a good theory that beings were coming from space and making those long, long runways there at Nazca and laying down these really huge figures and very accurately too, just like the crop circles are really accurate. They're done perfectly, and um, we know that the crop circles actually have a lot of energy in them that the rest of the field around the crop circles does not have. But as soon as you step into a crop circle, not the man-made ones. There are some man-made ones, but what we call the genuine ones from the mysterious source. Um, they definitely have energy, and it can be felt. It can be measured with pendulums and dowsing rods and electrostatic voltmeters and magnetometers and microwave detectors. So we know that, something profound has really happened to make that crop circle. I don't know if that's true of the Nazca figures because we weren't allowed to go into them. So I couldn't personally test that out. We could fly over them, that was fine, but they don't let anybody walk into them because they don't want them to be ruined. Yeah.
Right.
But anyway, that's a good question. I think it's basically the same sort of source, probably, and maybe done for different reasons. I think that the crop circles are done to for a number of reasons, and one of them is just to wake up humanity to think about where could these come from, and who could add this special energy into such perfect design. So it's gotten a lot of people to really wonder if there are others in space, and that's brought our attention to a much broader field of inquiry. But both phenomena, I think, of the extraterrestrial visits and the crop circles are really excellent.
Mm.
And those of us who are curious, like you are and I am, uh, it's just a wonderful thing to keep learning about and investigating as much as we can.
And I just had the comical thought in my head of because the Nazca lines have been around for so long that they were like, we made these lines in the desert and nobody sees them. And how long did it take them to create flight? We need to come up with a new way. Let's make a design in their crops. They'll get that faster.
People will notice them more, right? Yes, because of course, for many years, when you think about Nazca, uh, the people who lived there didn't see those figures because they were right there at ground level where the people are, and they might have seen an indented line going around in the soil, but they wouldn't have the perspective because they didn't had no way to get way up above them, to look down and see, oh, this is a perfect figure of a spider or a monkey or a hummingbird or whatever. Those were just some of them, the figures.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
It's funny too because when you were talking about the figures, I go the spider. Then you go like the spider. It's like we were in sync on which shape of the Nazca we were going to talk about.
very good. Any other questions?
Yes, Linda Judd is also asking, do you ever do hypnosis over the internet like on Zoom?
Oh, I do a lot of that, just as much as in person, if not more. Zoom, Skype, StreamYard, FaceTime, WhatsApp. Which is really wonderful because I can do them with people all over the world. So we make an appointment. You have to make an appointment ahead, of course. And yeah, it's wonderful that we have this ability to do that. And I think it's just as effective as the regressions that are done in person. I'm in San Diego, so certainly not everybody can get here. But thanks to Zoom, thanks even to COVID for
Yeah,
getting more of us to use these online formats to connect.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. We
if
have one two-part question want to if you're ready for that.
sure.
Or I didn't mean to interrupt you. If I interrupted you, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say, since we're talking about regressions, that a good way to contact me is to go to my website, There's lots of interesting information on the website, and that is barbaralamregression.com. barbaralamregression.com. And there is a portion, you scroll down, there's a place where you can write like you would write an email, and it will be forwarded to my email. And then I will answer it, we'll pick it up from there so that we could actually arrange a time for the regression. So barbaralamregression.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all the links to find Barbara are in the description, so you can find them there too. And Amber Rose has a question for you of she says, "Have you, Barbara, ever come across anyone who has had contact with beings that seem to be made of light or know what they might be?"
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, definitely. Some of these other dimensional beings I mentioned uh, look like certain shapes of light, and they have a presence about them. In other words, people who are encountering those, they feel like someone is there. It's a very noticeable presence. And yet, what they might see is a glowing shape or even just sort of a glowing area in the room. Yes, that happens a lot. So, in other words, there are beings from other dimensions that come for people, and people, I mean, beings that seem to be more physical that come for people as well.
Very cool. And so I came up with the question I was curious about is when you talk about when they're going in regression and the switching off that happens, have you ever encountered someone who was switched off and even in regression you could not switch it back on and recover the memory of what happened? That whatever it was, they blocked it so much that you just couldn't get it on a regression?
Yes, after a few thousand regressions for these purposes, I'd say there are about 5 or 6 people out of a few thousand who just couldn't get anywhere with it. Now, a couple of those people came back a second time, maybe a year later, and they were able to relax enough into it to be able to relive the experience. But so it has happened, but it's very rare. And sometimes afterwards, with one of those people, they say, I don't think I was really ready, really ready. I wanted the regression, but I don't think I was really, really ready to know. And maybe a year or so later, they'll feel more ready. And maybe they've learned more from other people and met more people who've survived it and survived it very well. And, they have more confidence that it would be okay to know.
Yeah. And
So,
I'm also, yeah, I was going to ask real quick is with it being blocked, say the mantis people are like, "Hey, we really don't want you to know what's going on." How would you be able to detect that it's not the person's not ready, it's the beings that don't want them to know?
well, in my experience with all this, um, it sort of changed a bit. Like back in the early 1990s, I think that there were more beings who didn't trust that it would be okay for people to know. And then as time has gone on, and they are aware that more and more people are talking about this, and there are various experiencer support groups around the country and other countries too. And so there's more sort of relaxation about this on the part of people. And I think that the beings, because they know so much about us, that they're aware of that and are more likely now to let people be aware. So they know how we humans are. They know that we do not trust things that we don't know, about things that are different that we don't know. They know how we don't trust each other. That is, one race or one cultural group doesn't trust another cultural group, and there's all that history built up around that. They know that about us, probably much more about us uh, than we even know ourselves, because we don't get the overview. We're too involved in it. But it seems like that's loosening up now, that more and more beings are thinking, oh, it's okay for these people to know now what we've been doing with them.
Okay, Linda has a question for you, but before I ask that, I'm kind of curious for a lot of people out there who may have had experiences or could benefit from regression, but they don't know they've had this experience. What is something they could look at and say, oh, I had this happening in my life. Maybe I should go to Barbara or someone else and do regression because that could really help me out. What is some of the signs of needing that, so to speak?
Yeah, well, good for you. There are a lot of clues, actually. Um, One of them is that a person will discover that there are unusual markings on their body. They'll wake up and see like a little perfect circle of what look like little pinprick marks, or a perfect triangle, and maybe a perfect square, like somebody made a little design there in their skin. Or they'll discover a little scoop mark, like a little scoop of skin has been taken out of a fleshy area. It might be the calf. That's the first one I saw, in a man's calf, or their arm, or their buttock, or their stomach, or just about anywhere. Another is they might find a little bump under their skin, which turns out to be an implant, a little bump that they can move around on their skin, but they don't see it because it's under the skin. Might be about the size of a BB, and might be in a round shape or a different shape. That might turn out to be an implant that the beings have put in there. Or they may have bruises, like a perfect triangular bruise around the navel, or somewhere on the abdomen if it's a woman, or in the upper inner thighs, looking like little fingertip bruises. That's very common. I've seen quite a number of those on women. And so anyway, unusual markings, that's a good clue. Another one certainly is missing time. Like I mentioned, the woman who missed 3 days of time, but it also happens to many people that when they're driving along in a car, that they will see some sort of area of light, or even a beam of light coming down to the car, and then the car motor starts to sort of falter and sounds like it's going to die out, and they'll pull off the road, hopefully. And then the craft comes closer, and the beings come and take the person. So they might have an hour or two of missing time. And sometimes when they sort of come to again, they'll be along the road, in the direction they were heading in originally. Sometimes the car is put down heading in the opposite direction. I know several cases of that. Uh, and there has been time missing too. It may be 15 minutes of missing time, or it might be an hour or 2 hours. Uh, anyway, those are certainly clues. that something has happened. Another clue is being particularly afraid, phobic about certain things. Like many people are very, very afraid of needles, like needles to draw blood or to do injections. And they subconsciously, you know, objected to something that was done by the other beings along that nature, with sort of a syringe needle type of thing. And some people are very phobic about going to any doctor or any hospital about anything, or even to visit somebody in the hospital, because the hospitals usually have light colored, very shiny floors. And very often the spacecrafts have shiny floors too. And that sort of subconsciously reminds the person of that being on the spacecraft, even though they may not consciously know that that's what they're being reminded of, because they don't consciously know that they've had those experiences yet. So yeah, those are some of the main indications that somebody might. And then of course sometimes people will have what seems like a dream, a vivid dream, because they're in bed sleeping at night. And what they have been thinking, maybe even for decades, they've been thinking that that was a very vivid dream that they just can't seem to forget about. And that when we go back into that, sometimes we realize that they thought it was a dream because they were in bed sleeping, but it really was an actual experience with some of these beings. So that's another one. If there's a dream that you just cannot let go of, even after a long period of time, that might be worth looking into.
Okay. So I think we kind of talked a little bit about this earlier, but I don't know if we mentioned the color. So I'm going to ask the question again: Is have you ever heard of a person under hypnosis come to have a visitor come through and for their field of vision become solid pink? I wonder if the ET person visiting was pink.
Well, these beings come in a lot of different colors, and I have heard of the pink ones. The pink ones, I think, tend to be more in the other dimensional realm. So in other words, they're composed of a different frequency than we are, not solid in the way that we experience ourselves to being. But yeah, I've heard of green ones, blue ones. The Arcturians are one of the better known about groups, and they are beautiful, tall beings who have faces that are very much like beautiful humans, and they have blue skin. And there are other races. There are some of the short ones that have blue skin. Some of the short ones have gray skin. Some of the short ones have white skin. I mean, there's really quite a variety.
Okay, yeah, and it makes me wonder. Like when I was growing up, I'd seen tall blue beans.
Ah,
So if I'm wondering if those were Arcturians or if some a different race, because it
uh-huh. Did they look
being tall.
right? Did they look? Uh, did their faces look fairly human?
From what I remember, yes, it was just, and to me, I may be calling them tall beans because when I seen them, I might have been like 3 feet tall, 4 feet tall.
Right.
So anything would be tall from that perspective, but
Yes, right. And of course, you weren't thinking about that at that age, how tall they might be. Yeah, so they could possibly be Arcturians, and I'm sure there are other species too that are blue. They have been reported by people, and white, like there are the tall white beings. One group is called the tall white zetas, And the mantis beings, some of them are a beautiful white, some of them are green or black, as I mentioned. Um, there's quite a variety. There are some that you don't hear about much, but that have come up in the regressions. Like one woman I regressed when I was in England. She had an experience where there was a tall being, not a mantis being, but it had a big beetle shell on it, on the whole middle part of its body, and then long, thin arms and long, thin legs. And it was uh, drawing her blood in like little pinprick type marks, little feelings. And she asked why they were doing this. And they said there was something about her blood that was very important for their newborns in their species, their beetle like species, that they needed a certain component that was in her blood as a human that would help their offspring to stay alive. Oh, and this reminds me that the whole huge subject we could get into maybe another time, about hybrids. That, there are hybrids who are living on the ship, and they are more extraterrestrial in proportion than human. And there's also a group of people, and I'm getting to know more and more of them, and wrote about them in the book called Meet the Hybrids with Miguel Mendonça, co author. And these are hybrids who live on Earth and who were born here, but were given extraterrestrial genetics when they were an embryo or when they were about 6 or 7 months in development in their mother's wombs. So they were born here and lived their whole lives here, and yet they are hybrid with certain extraterrestrial species. And then I want to mention that there are walk-in people. Some of your people may or may not know about those, but these are souls that came from either an extraterrestrial realm or a, a more spiritual realm. And they made a soul exchange with a person who was already living here on Earth and who didn't want to be here anymore. That soul leaves and goes into the spirit realm at the same moment that the incoming soul from extraterrestrial or spiritual realm comes in, takes up residence in that body, and lives the rest of that body's life with this whole new perspective, whole new consciousness. So we have written the book, Sheila Seppi and I have written a book, it's just published right now, called Cosmic Convergence. And this book is about walk ins and starseeds, people who have extraterrestrial lineage but were born here and are here to serve humanity, and a whole section on the hybrids. And I have given um, sort of condensed uh, versions of some of the cases that I have worked with of walk ins and cases of starseeds and cases with hybrids. And that's we can talk about that another time, as we will on this program. And but anyway, it's opening up to our being aware of more and more types of beings, even right here on Earth, that most of us have not been aware of before. And these people who are here as walk-in starseeds and hybrids, they are really here totally for good, totally help to raise the consciousness of humanity, get us going in a better direction, really helping all of humanity. So that's a very positive thing going on.
Yes, and I love how we're in sync because I was going to ask about that, and I was going to ask a question about the walk-ins, but shamelessly, I will plug. You are going to be coming back in December
Right?
with Sheila, your
Yes.
co-author.
Yes.
So I can save that question for then.
Sure. Yeah, that's good. And we'll give quite a lot of information at that time.
Yes,
So
December 17th.
good. Yes, I really look forward to that.
I
So
did too.
hopefully, we've stretched some minds a bit this time or confirmed some things for people who already may have known about these things. We certainly are not alone in the universe, physically and in terms of other dimensions as well. And it's very exciting to me that all of these things are opening up now for us to know more than I think they probably ever had in history. I mean, and maybe we're ready for it, or at least enough of us are ready to really learn about this bigger picture. As one of my friends says, "Oh, we want to get to know our space brothers and sisters all over the universe," and I think that's a lovely concept, rather
Yes.
than something to fear. Oh, and we get so many fear messages from our government. They're trying to protect us. They don't want invaders. They don't want anybody coming and trying to take over. Uh, and I don't, as far as I know, nobody is trying to take over. But it's easy to get into that fear of it just because it's unknown to us.
Right. And that was one of the things I was really appreciative of your sharing was that, like Preston, when he's on, and you both share the positive side. And it's like, I feel like we need to start bringing that into awareness with people is, yeah, I'm not saying, bad experiences don't happen, but that's not the only thing that happens. And so I think, yeah, we need to shine a light on the positive side as well.
Good for you. I completely agree. Yeah, it's easy. I think that we humans, myself included, easily get frightened about things that we don't know, that are strange, that are different, and this certainly fits those categories, this whole phenomenon. But I certainly have been discovering in the work that I've done with people that, oh, there is so much good in many, many of these experiences and many of the beings. So maybe next time we can talk a little bit about hybrid children that Earth people are discovering that they have. And the hybrid children tend to be living on the ships with the other beings whose genetics they have. If they have more genetics in common with the extraterrestrials, then they would not be able to live here. And so they spend their whole lives on the ships or on other planets. And yet, those who have more in proportion of human genetics in them, they can live here. But there are reports that there is a big ship full of hybrid children, about 3,000 miles up from the Earth, flying around. It's been flying around for some years now, waiting for humanity to become more open about them so that they could land here and live here in a certain colony prepared for them. And so, in other words, those hybrids would have enough genetics of human in them, as well as extraterrestrial, so that they could actually managed to live here. You see, we have a different frequency here, and we have different uh, germs and viruses and bacteria and so forth that those beings are not accustomed to. They wouldn't be able to survive here very well unless they have a lot of human in us. And even then, um, if they come and land here and be here, um, they need special care because they're not used to our bacteria and viruses. And they would have to have quite an adjustment period, no doubt, before actually living right in with humanity. But there may be that coming. And there are even people I personally know who are trying to prepare a rural community for these hybrid children to live in. And of course, they'd need human adults for teaching them and helping them to eat the way that we eat and to adapt to human life. But some of that is already being developed. It's coming into place. So we may hear of that eventually, that there are colonies of these hybrid children living here.
Yes, and Linda has a question about the hybrid children, and I have questions, but let's just say wait until the next episode. And I
Okay.
can honestly say I'm wishing right now tomorrow was the next episode and
Right.
time warp because I'm so excited about the topic, but it'll be well worth the wait.
Okay. What did Linda wonder about?
Oh, she was wanting to know if you've had the opportunity to meet any of the hybrid children.
Well, I have met hybrid adults, and I have met a couple of children whom I suspect, don't know for sure, but whom I suspect are hybrids too. And it could be, this is just a theory, it could be that some of the people on the autism spectrum might possibly be hybrids. And that's why they seem different. They kind of function differently than the rest of us. And they're labeled with autism. I don't know about that. I have not done a study of that, but it's a question in my mind. That doesn't necessarily mean all autistic children are hybrids, but some of them might possibly be. And so they seem to function a bit differently than we do. They might look like regular human children, but their psyche, their minds might work quite differently. And so it's a challenge to be here. Anyway, that's a very interesting question that we can all be thinking about as a
Yeah, and
possibility.
I
Yeah.
would also venture to say not only could they be hybrid, but starseed as well, because
Yeah.
they operate on a different level than we do. And I've worked with some autistic children when I was in high school, and I have to say, some of them I would feel like were on a higher level than even I was.
Mm.
I was like, because they could understand. It's just they had to have help pointing how to communicate it,
Right.
where others are, they couldn't communicate as well. And so I was like, okay. And so I'm wondering if it's different cultures adapt differently. And like you were saying, maybe the ones that were higher cognitive, studied us more. So they were like ahead
Yeah.
of us,
Yeah.
where the ones that were lagging a little bit, so to speak, were probably new to the field and saying, hey, we could send people to, kind of gather info for us. And we're like, you're slow. And it's not they're slow, it's they don't know how to operate here yet.
Oh yeah, and they may be way ahead of us in many ways, but because they can't communicate that adequately, as you said, uh, we don't recognize that they're really advanced in many ways.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, so that's great that you worked with some of them and knew them and had the breadth of mind to think that, oh, maybe they're pretty special in some ways,
yeah,
and certainly
it
maybe.
was like, yeah, I was gonna say, when everybody would call them names, it's
Yeah.
like I would be looking at them going, you realize these people could probably do more damage to you in a split second, and you're going to tease them, and you
uh,
know I'm like, are you who is the smarter one here, them who walk away and just ignore you, or and it's like I actually learned a lot from them.
that's great. I love to hear that. I hope that they knew that too. Do
I'm
you?
sure on some level they did.
Yeah, that because I mean that would be the kind of compliment that they could really use. That they need probably because they feel different. So the hybrid people whom I know and have written about, um, they always feel different, and so do some of the starseeds. They always feel different than everybody else around them, even different than their own families, and certainly different than other children as they're growing up. And all the ones that I know always feel that their real family, their true family, is not the one that they were born to, but is out there somehow in space. And they miss them and they want them. And they have visits from the these beings. We think of them as extraterrestrial, uh, but some of those beings visit these hybrid people when they're children and all through their lives. And they totally welcome the visits from their being because they feel like they're their true family.
Right. And speaking of family, Linda has a question I feel like everybody that knows you is one the answer to. Has Ruben met his son yet?
Oh, I don't know, but I'm laughing because just last night, a friend sent me a podcast on my cell phone of an interview that I did with Ruben. He interviewed me. And this must have been probably around 2010. So quite a number of years ago now. And I had a lot of people come to me having seen that podcast, and then they wanted to come for regressions. And so I keep getting reminded of that interview and never saw it until last night. Somebody was able to send it to me on my cell phone. So I don't know if Ruben has actually met his his hybrid son, but many people I have regressed have met their hybrid child or children, and they may or may not have known that they even had those children until we did the regressions. And then they were very happy to go back to an experience that they had not consciously known about, but they had had of being with their hybrid child or children. One woman I know, and Ruben Langdon interviewed her too, um, Bridget Nielsen, she discovered that she has 35 hybrid children, all living on spaceships. And then since then, there are many people I've worked with who have discovered that they have one or five or maybe eight or 10 hybrid children living on the spaceship, and that they get to visit them once in a while. And often they don't know that until we've done a regression to one of those experiences. So there are many people whom I have met in the last, say, 30 years or so, who are really, really pleased to have hybrid children and would like to have much more contact with them. And you see, the hybrid children who grow up on the ship, they don't have a mother father situation. Um, they have a mother father in terms of sperm and eggs who are on Earth, but they don't have contact in terms of living with them on the ship. But more and more people have done regressions with me where in the regression they are going on the ship and into a special room where there might be a whole group of children, hybrid children, who are being taught. And so they're being raised sort of in a collective situation. And yet they also have the ability to know who their human mother or their human father is when the human mother or human father visits the ship and shows up. So some of those parents, Earth parents, and hybrid children, get to know each other to some extent and form an ongoing relationship. And that's very, very rewarding for those people who get to do that. So some of them have had human children here on Earth in the usual way that we do, and also have some hybrid children whom they know about. Some people I know have not had human children here on Earth, and so they particularly prize and are interested in the hybrid children and just wish they could see them a whole lot more and get to know them. But they're being guided a lot, they're being brought up collectively, and they seem to be happy when we people get to see them. And so it's just interesting, very interesting to me that all of this is going on out there in space. And I certainly had no awareness of it
No.
the last 20 or 30 years. Yeah, there's a lot
Well,
going on.
yes, and I want to thank you for spending this evening with us, and so grateful for you sharing your knowledge and your experiences with us.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. I'm so delighted that you are open and interested in all of this.
Yes, and I have so many more questions, but I'm like, we're at the 2 hour mark, and I'm like, and I know you have things to do, and so I'm trying to be respectful at going, excuse me.
Okay, and
Yes, and there's a part two.
and your audience has things to do, I'm sure. But we'll meet again, and I'm always happy to share.
Well, thank you. And one thing I would like to ask is before we go is I like to ask the guest from your life experience, what is a golden nugget you would like to leave the audience who's watching this show with?
The universe, the cosmos is absolutely teeming with life. Even Carl Sagan, many years ago now, said that at a college commencement address in Claremont, California, which I attended. And I was so thrilled when he said, the cosmos is teeming and teeming with life. And I sat there in the audience smiling and beaming because I was already doing some of this work at that time. This was in the 1990s, I think. Anyway, the universe is full of life, and it's very intelligent, highly developed life, and a lot of the beings would really like to see Earth and humans do better. They are caring about us. They would like us to become more aware of them, more aware of different aspects of reality, and to raise our consciousness so that we can become part of the great galactic federation of many, many beings. So just keep opening and learning, adjusting to the new things that you learn, and having a favorable view of it all rather than the negative. We've got to watch out because they might be here to take over the world. Um, I mean, there could be some species who want to do that, but there is so much good out there, and I'd like us to recognize that as well.
I agree. And so, with that, I'm going to say to everyone, wherever you are in the world, make it a blessed day, afternoon, morning. And if you're asleep, please wake up and watch this episode when you can.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Michael. You've been wonderful.
Thank you, and I so appreciate you, and I appreciate you coming back on December 17th. And so, looking forward to that. And to everyone out there, make it a blessed day. Fill it with positivity and open yourself up to what's out there. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Okay, we're out.
Hi. Well, that was exciting.
It was.
Good and good questions.
Well, thank you. And yeah, and I was kind of liked the way you approached like the Nazca because I had never read or heard anyone say that it's grooved into the ground. I've always heard
Yeah.
it's on the ground, and so when you said grooved, I was like, that makes it even more interesting. Like, and I started thinking, how they had the laser lights on the ship to do surgeries and stuff.
Yeah.
Could it have been a laser that made that? And I was like, well, no, because then you would have had the dust around, and it's so clean by those lines. It's like, how did
Yeah.
somebody like vacuum
Yeah. You don't. You
behind
don't.
it?
You don't see piles of dirt around the lines that are carved into the earth. You don't. It's just plain earth, and then indentation for the lines of the figures.
And I don't know anybody who could ever say those are man made because you would have had to have somebody hovering above with the walkie talkie that says, okay, step now to your right, go two
Yeah.
steps, and then we're going to make the angle to the left.
Well, they would have had to be floating up above or hovering somehow, which
Yeah.
was, yeah. So I I don't think people did those. I think that I think that the beings came and noticed some of the life forms that we have here on Earth, and then drew those pictures. And maybe it was done by laser beams. Do you know that up in Idaho, there's a big desert area up there, and out in the middle of that desert, there's a great, huge design, hundreds of feet on each side, in kind of a square shape. It's the Sri Yantra symbol from Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. And so it's like a crop circle, except that it's incised into the hard earth, kind of a hard desert floor, like in Nazca. So that
Mm.
may have been done in the same way that the Nazca figures and Nazca lines were.
And I mean, when you look at them, like, the shape of the spider, the bird, the astronaut, the monkey. It's like all of these things. Maybe one is local to that area, so you're like, okay, I could get someone making that, somehow. But if you've never traveled, how do you know about the monkey or this type of bird to
Yeah,
make the symbol? So
that's right.
somebody had to bring that information.
Well, if the ETs came from such a huge distance, they could go anywhere on the world and come close and see those life forms that you're talking about, even if they're not in Peru, and then took those designs, to Peru and did it. And a very interesting thing to me is that when I was in Peru, we went south along the coast from Lima toward where Nazca is, and there's a little island not too far off the coast of Peru in that general area where Nazca is. And on the island, it looks like a sandy slope going up like a mountain of plain tan sand. And in that, I don't know if it really is sand or rock, but it looks like sand. In that tan sandy hillside is carved a giant uh, trident, like three.
Like Poseidon's trident.
Poseidon, yeah, like
Yes.
with a special little figure at the top, and that trident is pointing directly down the coast, 81 miles to where the Nazca drawings and the Nazca lines are. So it looks like if there were any spacecrafts coming along, and they'd see the trident and they'd keep following it straight down the coast, that they would get to the Nazca area.
Mm.
It
And
looks like a sign. Keep going, fellas. You're almost there.
you've
Doing,
made it to the right place. Here's
yeah,
the glyph. Now just find which one you want to land at.
yeah. I mean, when I saw that, I thought, oh my gosh. And when I was there, that was 1981. That was 10 years before I got involved in this work. But even then, I just knew, ah, I think there are visitors that have come from way out there that have seen that trident and just keep going right on down the coast, and boom, there they are at the ideal place for them to make their landing size strips and the figures.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder what is so special about Nazca that it's really primarily the only place those are found. And like you're saying, you have the trident pointing to it, and it's like it's a desert, so it's
Yeah.
like there's not a lot of people living there or that we know of.
No.
And so it's like, what is so special about this area that someone took the time to make these glyphs here, isolated from everyone? And so maybe it's like you're saying, the craft could come and go pretty much as they want with very little human interference.
Yes, yes. That would have been a big feature. I mean, there have been excavations in the Nazca area, and found that there were some very ancient people live there, but not like a big civilization. It seemed like what they've discovered so far is it would have been a very, very slim population. Anything before this, the people who live there now. But so, yeah, it would be very remote from most humans being aware of them. That
Mhm.
might have been one of the reasons.
And like you pointed out, a lot of crop circles are in the UK. And so it got me thinking, kind of wondering